The galaxy was once a tapestry of disconnected threads, a vast and silent void where the remnants of a shattered humanity clung to the husks of dying worlds. 4,000 or 5,000 years, the long night had reigned, an era of regression and terror where the achievement of the past was swallowed by the warp. But that night has ended. From the cradle of terror, a new sun has risen, and its light is cast by the will of a single, enigmatic figure. He is the master of mankind, the architect of a future that many believed was lost forever. Under his guidance, the Great Crusade has begun, a monumental undertaking to weave those scattered threads back into a single, unified whole. Across the Segmentum Solar, the silence of the void is broken by the roar of fusion engines and the rhythmic pulse of warp drives. Thousands of expeditionary fleets strike out into the unknown, their hulls gleaming with the heraldry of a nascent empire. They carry with them the promise of the Imperial truth, a philosophy of reason and secularism designed to banish the shadows of superstition and the predations of the alien. It is a time of absolute confidence, an age where the word impossible has been struck from the lexicons of man. The Emperor himself is a distant but pervasive presence. To the billions of citizens on newly integrated worlds, he is less a man and more a force of nature, and distant authority whose vision provides a foundation for every law and every brick laid in his name. He does not seek worship, yet the sheer scale of his ambition inspires a devotion that borders on the divine. He moves through the stars not as a conqueror, but as a restorer, reclaiming what was stolen and rebuilding what was broken. His power is the anchor of the Imperium, a psychic beacon that guides the navigators through the shifting tides of the immaterium. Beside him, or leading the vanguard in his stead, are his sons, the Primarchs. They are the pinnacle of human potential, beings of such physical and mental magnitude that they dwarf the legends of old. Each is a master of war, a scholar of strategy, and a leader of men. They are the generals of the Legiones Astartes, the transhuman warriors who serve as the steel tip of the Crusade spear. Among these demigods, one stands above all others in the Emperor's esteem. Horus, the brightest star, the first found and most beloved. To look upon Horus is to see the personification of the Great Crusade success, charismatic, tactical, and utterly loyal. The bond between the father and the son is the bedrock upon which the hope of the galaxy rests. In these early years, the expansion is rapid and seemingly unstoppable. World after world is brought into the fold, sometimes through the silver tongue of diplomacy and other times through the overwhelming fire of the legions. There is a profound sense of unity, a shared belief that humanity's manifest destiny is to rule the stars. The horrors of the age of strife are fading into memory, replaced by the industrious hum of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the orderly administration of the burgeoning Imperial tithe. The citadels being raised are not just fortresses, they are monuments to a peace that is intended to last for eternity. Yet, even in this era of blinding light, there are those who feel the weight of the silence that follows a victory. The Emperor's vision is total, leaving little room for the nuances of the cultures he absorbs. The Primarchs, for all their glory, are weapons designed for a specific purpose, and as the borders of the Imperium push further into the dark, some begin to wonder what place such weapons will have in a galaxy finally at peace. The confidence is absolute, yes, but it is a confidence built upon the assumption that the shadows will never truly bite back. For now, the triumphs continue. The gala events on Terra celebrate the compliance of entire star systems. The maps of the galaxy are being redrawn daily, the red of the Imperium bleeding across the stars. It is a morning of a new empire, and the air is thick with the scent of ozone and the cold, crisp promise of a future secured. The Emperor watches from his high throne, his mind already reaching toward deeper secrets and even greater heights, while his sons carry his banner to the very edge of the light. The stars are becoming a garden again, tended by the hands of giants. The darkness is receding, and for the first time in millennia, humanity looks to the night sky not with fear, but with a quiet, steady gaze of master returning home. The great work is well underway, and the foundation is solid. The galaxy is quiet, the fleets are in transit, and the Emperor's dream remains unbroken. The silence of the void is never truly empty. It is a heavy, expectant thing, filled with the ghosts of lost civilizations and the slow, rhythmic thrum of the expeditionary fleets. As the Great Crusade pushes deeper into the galactic wilderness, the sense of unity described in the early annals begins to take on a harder, more industrial edge. The initial wonder of the reclamation has matured into a relentless machine of progress. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, the atmosphere is one of focused intensity. Hey, Horus Lupercal moves among his officers not as a distant god, but as the ultimate commander, his presence a catalyst that turns doubt into certainty and hesitation into action. The War Master is a living embodiment of the Emperor's will, yet in these quiet hours between warp jumps, one can see the subtle shifts in the air, the way the light of the Imperial truth catches the edges of his plate, casting long, sharp shadows that seem to dance with a life of their own. The expansion is no longer merely about finding lost brothers or reconnecting with ancient cousins of the Terran bloodline. It has become a grand architectural project, an attempt to impose a perfect, sterile order upon a universe that has spent millennia in the grip of entropy. The Mechanicum of Mars follows in the wake of the Legions, their massive forge ships descending upon reclaimed worlds like metal locusts, only to leave behind shimmering cities of steel and logic. They do not merely build, they excavate the very soul of the planet, replacing its old myths with the cold, hard reality of the machine. To the common soldier of the Imperial army, this is a time of unparalleled glory. They march beneath banners that have never known the soil of defeat, bolstered by the knowledge that the greatest mind in human history is guiding their every step. There is a comfort in this absolute authority, a relief in the idea that the chaotic whims of the universe have finally been mastered by the singular vision of the throne. Yet, as the fleets move further from the light of the Astronomicon, the scale of the task begins to reveal its true, daunting nature. The galaxy is not a passive canvas waiting for the Emperor's brush. It is a jagged, hostile expanse filled with horrors that do not recognize the sovereignty of man. In the dark corners of the Ultima Segmentum, the legions encounter xenos empires of such cruelty and strange power that even the transhuman Astartes are tested to their limits. These are not the quick, decisive compliances of the early years. These are grinding wars of attrition, fought in the crushing gravity of gas giants and the freezing airlessness of asteroid belts. It is here, in the grit and the blood, that the first flickers of a different kind of awareness begin to take root. The warriors of the legions begin to define themselves not just by their loyalty to terror, but by the specific brand of brotherhood forged in their own fires. The seeds of local pride and martial cults are sown in the very soil they claim for the Emperor, a quiet divergence that the administrators on distant Earth are too preoccupied to notice. Horus, ever the diplomat and the strategist, navigates these shifting tides with a grace that seems almost supernatural. He is the bridge between the Emperor's lofty ideals and the brutal reality of the front lines. He listens to the grievances of his brother Primax, the brooding resentment of Perturbo, the wild independence of Russ, the silent perfectionism of Fulgrim. He is the knot that holds the fraying ends of the Crusade together, the only one capable of translating the Emperor's silence into commands that his brothers can respect. But even for a being of his magnitude, the burden is immense. The Emperor has begun to withdraw more frequently to his private sanctums on Terra, leaving the day-to-day management of the galaxy to the Council and the War Master. This distance creates a vacuum, a space where the cold, logical light of the Imperial truth begins to feel increasingly lonely. The warmth of the Father is being replaced by the iron decree of the ruler, and in that transition, the nature of the bond between the Creator and his creations begins to warp. On the newly compliant world of Aurelius, the silence is profound. The marble plazas are empty of the old gods, the statues of forgotten kings topple and ground into dust to make way for the austere monuments of the Imperium. The air is clean, the water is pure, and the laws are absolute. It is a paradise of reason, yet there is a hollowness to it that defies the official reports. The citizens go about their lives with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, their eyes reflecting the cold gray of the Imperial administration. They are being saved from the darkness, but in the process, they are being stripped of the very things that once made their survival meaningful. This is the paradox of the Great Crusade. To save humanity, the Emperor must often demand that it shed its most human traits, its capacity for wonder, its need for the inexplicable, its inherent desire for something greater than mere survival. As the second century of the Crusade draws toward its zenith, the momentum remains undeniable, but the friction is increasing. The logistics of maintaining an empire that spans the stars are starting to show signs of strain. Every world brought into the fold requires a garrison. Every garrison requires supplies, and every supply line is a target for the shadows that still lurk in the warp. The confidence of the early years is hardened into a brittle arrogance. The commanders of the fleet speak of the galaxy as if it were already conquered, ignoring the vast, unmapped regions that pulse with an ancient, malevolent energy. They believe the darkness has been banished because they have turned on the lights, failing to realize that some things only become more dangerous when they are seen. In his private chambers, Horus stands before a map of the stars, his hand hovering over the glowing nodes of 1,000 worlds. He is the master of all he surveys, the heir to a dream that is rapidly becoming a reality. And yet, there is a quiet, persistent ache at the back of his mind, a sense that the peace he is building is a fragile shell, a temporary reprieve before a storm that has no name. The unity of the Imperium is a magnificent achievement, a golden horizon that stretches out forever. But horizons, by their very nature, are unreachable. They are an illusion of the eye, a boundary that shifts as one approaches it. The expansion of the Imperium was not merely a movement of ships and soldiers. It was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of an awakening titan. As the Great Crusade pushed deeper into the Segmentum Ultima, the scale of the undertaking began to shift the very nature of human perception. Distance, once measured in the agonizing lifetimes of the Age of Strife, was now bridged by the indomitable will of the Navigator houses and the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon. Yet, even as the light of terror stretched further into the galactic east, the sheer vacuum of the unknown began to exert a different kind of pressure upon the crusading fleets. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of anticipation. In this era, the Emperor's presence was a dual reality. To the High Lords in the inner circles of the hegemony, he was a tireless architect, a man of cold logic and transcendent geometry who spent his hours calculating the trajectories of species and the stability of stellar empires. But to the rank-and-file soldier of the Imperial army, or the newly inducted scribe on a distant hive world, he was a mythic constancy. He was the golden sun around which all human ambition orbited. His decrees were not merely laws. They were the fundamental principles of a new existence. When a world was brought into compliance, it was not just annexed, it was redeemed. The past, with its fractured myths and its terrors of the warp, was scrubbed away by the secular purity of the imperial truth. This was the era of the Great Forgetting, where the superstitions of the old night were replaced by the cold, comforting steel of reason. Horus Lupercal, the Lupercal of the 16th Legion, moved through this burgeoning empire like a god of antiquity. At this stage of the crusade, his relationship with his father was a golden thread that held the disparate expeditionary fleets together. While other primates were often defined by their specific eccentricities, the brooding stoicism of Pachurabo, the savage nobility of Lemonruss, or the artisan soul of Fulgrim, Horus was a quintessential diplomat warrior. He possessed the unique ability to speak to the soul of every man he encountered, from the lowliest deckhand to the most haughty of planetary governors. In his presence, the way to the Emperor's distant authority felt personal, warm, and achievable. He was a living proof that the Emperor's vision was not a cold tyranny, but a shared glory. The compliance of the world known as 6319 stands as a testament to this period of supreme confidence. It was a world that claimed to be the true terror, a mirror image of humanity's cradle that had preserved its own distorted history. In later ages, such a discovery might have been met with suspicion or immediate purgation, but in the early crusade, it was handled with a tragic, paternal patience. The Emperor's forces did not arrive as destroyers, but as brothers reclaiming a long-lost sibling who had simply lost their way in the dark. The tragedy of the conflict that followed was not born of malice, but of a fundamental misunderstanding of the scale of the universe. The inhabitants of that world believed they were the center of the cosmos. The Imperium knew they were but a single grain of sand on an infinite shore. As the legions moved from system to system, the logistics of empire building followed in their wake. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars, were the silent partners in this cosmic reclamation. For every world the Astartes conquered, the Mechanicus provided the means to sustain it. Great orbital plates were constructed to manage the flow of resources. Atmospheric processes were ignited to turn toxic waste into breathable air. The sound of the crusade was not just a roar of the bolter, but the rhythmic clanging of the forge and the low, constant hum of data looms processing the census of a billion souls. There was a profound beauty in this order, a sense that the universe was finally being put right, that the chaos of the natural world was being tamed by the superior intellect of man. Yet, beneath the veneer of this perfect order, the first ripples of a deeper complexity were beginning to form. The Emperor began to spend more time in his private sanctums. His mind turned toward projects that he shared with few, not even his most favored sons. The administration of the Imperium was beginning to transition from the hands of the warriors who won it to the hands of the bureaucrats who would manage it. This shift, subtle at first, created a faint but perceptible tension. The Primarchs were masters of the Crusade, but they were not necessarily masters of the peace. As the borders moved further away, the central authority of terror began to feel more like a weight than a light. Horus, ever sensitive to the morale of his brothers and his men, felt these shifts most keenly. He remained the steadfast champion of his father's will, but the questions of the future began to color the margins of his thoughts. What happens to the storm when the sky finally clears? What becomes of the sword when there are no more monsters to slay? These were not yet seeds of doubt, but rather the natural reflections of a mind that had seen too much of the galaxy to believe in simple endings. The Crusade was a journey without a visible horizon, and the momentum of the great work was so vast that it seemed it could never truly stop. The evening of this golden age was still far off, but the shadows were beginning to lengthen in the corners of the conquered palaces. The Emperor's light was at its zenith, blindingly bright and all-consuming. It was a time of heroes and legends, where the galaxy felt small and manageable under the heel of the transhuman. The dreams of humanity were no longer confined to the soil of a single world. They were written in the stars themselves, a grand narrative of a species that had refused to die in the dark. As the fleets prepared for their next jump, the quiet of the void returned, momentarily reclaiming the space between the stars. The soldiers slept in their cryo cells, the Primarchs studied their star charts, and the Emperor looked out from a bridge of his flagship, his eyes seeing things that lay far beyond the physical realm. The Great Crusade moved on, a slow and majestic tide of gold and iron, washing over the galaxy and leaving behind the orderly silence of a new dawn. As the Great Crusade matured from a desperate reclamation into a functioning interstellar state, the nature of the Emperor's authority began to manifest in the cold, unyielding language of administration. On 1,000 worlds, the smoke of burning resistance was replaced by the drifting incense of the iterator and the rhythmic scratching of the scribe. The transition from war to governance was not a sudden event, but a slow, encroaching tide that redefined the meaning of compliance. To be compliant was no longer merely a matter of bowing to the golden banners of the Astartes. It meant the total integration of a planet soul into the vast, hungry machinery of the Imperium. The Imperial tide became the new pulse of the galaxy, a logistical heartbeat that demanded men, awe, and faith in the secular creed of the throne world. This was the era where the glory of the front line met the grim reality of the backroom, and in that friction, the first true cracks in the idealistic facade of the Crusade began to appear. In the high spires of newly christened hive worlds, the administrators of the Council of Terror began to exercise a power that felt alien to the warriors who had shed blood for the soil. These were men of parchment and law, distant figures who viewed the galaxy as a series of ledgers to be balanced. To them, a star system was not a bastion of human spirit, but a source of raw material for the next wave of expansion. This shift in focus created a growing disconnect between the Emperor's distant, lofty vision and the practical, often brutal, implementation of his will by the mortal bureaucracy. The Primarchs, those titans of genetic perfection, found themselves increasingly at odds with this new order. They were creatures of the battlefield, designed for the purity of the strike and the honor of the conquest. To see their victories reduced to tax brackets and labor quotas was a subtle insult that many bore in silence, though the weight of it pressed heavily upon their transhuman hearts. Horus Lupercal, ever the diplomat, attempted to bridge this widening chasm. He spent as much time in the company of the High Lord's representatives as he did with his own captains, weaving a tapestry of compromise that kept the engine of the Crusade turning. Yet, even Horus could feel the shift in the wind. The Emperor had returned to Terra to oversee the next phase of his grand design, the secret work beneath the Imperial palace that even his sons were forbidden to know. This withdrawal left a void of paternal guidance that the War Master was forced to fill, though he lacked the absolute, ontological certainty of his father. Without the Emperor's physical presence to anchor the Crusade, the different legions began to drift further into their own idiosyncratic cultures. The World Eaters grew more bellicose, the Word-Bearers more fervent in their forbidden devotions, and the Night Lords more sadistic in their enforcement of the peace. The unity of the early years was being replaced by a fragmented series of private crusades, each led by a Primarch who felt the cold shadow of the Terran bureaucracy creeping up behind them. On the world of Colchis, and others like it, the implementation of the imperial truth became a grinding process of cultural erasure. The old temples were not just closed. They were reproposed into centers of industry. The ancient songs of the people were replaced by the monotonous hymns of the machine. The peace that the Imperium brought was absolute, but it was a piece of the grave for any culture that did not fit the narrow parameters of the Emperor's design. This was a hopeless battle that no bolter could win, the struggle to maintain the human spirit under the crushing weight of a perfect, sterile logic. The soldiers of the Imperial army, once proud liberators, now found themselves acting as. The expansion of the Imperium has always been a symphony of industry, a rhythmic clanging of hammers against the anvil of the galaxy. In this middle era of the Great Crusade, the music has reached a resonant, steady tempo. The initial frantic energy of the liberation of Sol has matured into the methodical administration of the Segmentum Obscurus and the reaches of the Gal stars. It is a period where the Emperor's vision is no longer a radical dream, but the foundational reality of trillions. On worlds that have not seen a xenos raider in a generation, the Imperial truth is as certain as the rising of a binary sun. The tide ships arrive with the precision of celestial bodies, their holds filling with the minerals, grains, and manpower required to fuel a crusade that shows no sign of slowing. Change. They are becoming governors, administrators, and symbols, roles that some embrace with ease and others with growing, unspoken resentment. The silence of a peaceful world is a heavy thing for a warrior whose veins pulse with the genetic legacy of a conqueror. In the private galleries of the vengeful spirit, Horus often stands alone, looking out at the stars he has claimed. He sees the beauty of the order he has created, but he also senses the friction of the machine. The galaxy is vast, and the light of the Astronomicon, while brilliant, casts shadows that are longer and deeper than any would care to admit. These shadows are not merely physical. They are the echoes of cultures that have been erased, the ghosts of belief systems that were deemed incompatible with the imperial truth. The Emperor has decreed that there are no gods, that the universe is a cold, logical place governed by the laws of physics and the will of man. This clarity is the Imperium's greatest strength, but it is also a void that some find difficult to fill. On the fringes of the crusade, among the common soldiers and the displaced civilians, small, forbidden cults are beginning to. As the Great Crusade pushed into the final, jagged reaches of the galactic rim, the atmosphere within the expeditionary fleets underwent a subtle, chemical change. The exuberant momentum of the early decades had solidified into a heavy, rhythmic persistence. On the bridge of the flagship Vengeful Spirit, the air was often thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of data slates being processed by the thousands. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, stood as a pillar of golden light amidst this gray, industrial fatigue. His eyes, which had once sparkled with the simple joy of reunion and conquest, now held a depth of calculation that bordered on the melancholic. He was no longer just a general. He was the administrator of a sprawling, celestial organism that demanded constant, agonizing attention. The Emperor's silence from distant terror had become a physical weight, a void that Horus was forced to fill with his own charisma and his own increasingly strained certainties. The hopeless battle was no longer being fought against the green-skinned orcs or the spindly, treacherous xenos of the void. It was being fought in the quiet corners of the soul, where the individual soldier began to wonder if the peace they were building was merely a different kind of war. On worlds like 6319, where the dust of the old civilization had barely settled, the new imperial order was being erected with a speed that felt violent. The iterators moved through the crowds, their voices amplified by voxcasters, weaving the imperial truth into the fabric of the local culture until the original threads were completely invisible. This was a conquest of the mind, a systematic dismantling of every myth and legend that did not serve the interests of the throne world. To the citizens of these worlds, the Emperor was a distant, terrifyingly perfect figure whose love was expressed through the iron hand of his tax collectors and the silent, brooding presence of the Astartes garrisons. The Primarchs themselves were becoming more like the worlds they conquered, insular, defensive, and fiercely protective of their own traditions. The brotherhood that had once been the bedrock of the crusade was now a collection of competing egos and conflicting philosophies. Pachurabo, the master of siegecraft, looked upon the grand palaces of his brothers with a cold, simmering resentment, seeing only the waste of resources and the lack of functional utility. Lorga, the seeker of truth, walked the halls of his flagship with a haunted expression, his devotion to the Emperor taking on a fervent, hidden intensity that the secular edicts of terror could not quench. Even the Lion, the most loyal of sons, grew increasingly distant, his knightly traditions turning the First Legion into a secretive order that spoke in riddles and acted in shadows. Horus watched all of this with the weary patience of a shepherd who knows that his flock is beginning to scatter. In the lower decks of the massive troop transports, among the millions of mortal soldiers who made up the Imperial army, a different kind of silence reigned. These men and women had seen the horrors of the galaxy firsthand, the warp-spawn nightmares and the alien atrocities that the Imperial truth claimed did not exist. They lived in a state of cognitive dissonance, their eyes seeing the impossible while their ears heard the rationalizations of the iterators. This gap between reality and doctrine was a fertile soil in which the first seeds of secret cults and forbidden fellowships began to sprout. They sought meaning in the darkness, a way to reconcile the cold, mechanical logic of the Imperium with the visceral, chaotic terror of the void. They were the silent majority of the Crusade, the fuel for the machine, and their growing sense of alienation was a pressure that no Vox edict could fully suppress. The logistics of the Crusade had become a monster that threatened to consume its creators. Every day, thousands of ships were lost to the unpredictable tides of the warp, their crews vanishing into the maw of the immaterium without a trace. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in their quest for ancient knowledge, pushed the boundaries of their own protocols, searching for the standard template construct data that would give them the edge they needed to sustain the Empire. Their devotion was not to the Emperor, but to the machine god, a subtle distinction that created a growing friction with the secular authorities of Terra. The forge worlds they established were fortresses of industry, where the human element was minimized in favor of the efficient pulse of the piston and the logic of the cog. The piece of the Imperium was beginning to look like a vast, interstellar factory, where the output was order and the raw material was a human spirit. As the Great Crusade pushed its borders toward the final, jagged edges of the galactic rim, the physical distance from Terra began to manifest as a psychological weight upon the expeditionary fleets. The further the legions marched from the light of the solar system, the more the Imperial truth began to feel like a cold, academic abstraction rather than a living pulse. On the bridges of the massive Gloriana-class battleships, the commanders looked out not at a galaxy to be liberated, but at a void that seemed to swallow the very concept of human significance. The Emperor, once a golden figure who walked among his sons on the soot-stained fields of industrial worlds, had become a silent architect, a ghost in the machine of his own empire. His return to the throne world to begin the secret works of the Webway project had left a vacuum of charisma that not even the most decorated primarch could entirely fill. This was the era of the Great Transition, where the raw, muscular energy of conquest was being slowly strangled by the velvet ropes of administrative necessity. The Council of Terra, now populated by highborn officials and master logisticians who had never heard the roar of a bolter in anger, began to exert a different kind of sovereignty. They spoke of the Crusade in terms of caloric intake, ore yields, and population sustainability. To these mortals, the Primarchs were no longer the divine signs of the living God. They were expensive, temperamental assets that required oversight. This burgeoning civilian authority sat ill with the transhuman warriors of the legions. In the barracks of the Iron Warriors or the dark cells of the Night Lords, a quiet resentment began to fester, a feeling that the galaxy won by the blood of the Astartes was being handed over to men who viewed courage as a line item on a ledger. The most hopeless battle was shifting its front. It was no longer a war against the alien, but a silent struggle for the soul of the Imperium itself. The warriors who had been forged for a universe of eternal war were now being asked to build a universe of eternal peace, and many found that they lacked the tools for such a delicate construction. Horus Lupercal, burdened with the title of War Master, felt this friction more keenly than any other. He was the fulcrum upon which the entire military apparatus of the Imperium balanced. To his brothers, he was the only one who truly understood the cost of their victories. To the Council, he was the only one who could keep the demigods in check. The diplomacy required to maintain this equilibrium was exhausting, even for a being of his staggering intellect. He found himself increasingly isolated, caught between the silence of a father who would not share his secrets and the bickering of brothers who felt abandoned by that same father. The atmosphere on the vengeful spirit grew heavy with the scent of old loyalties being tested by new realities. Horus began to look at the maps of the galaxy not with the hunger of a conqueror, but with the weary eyes of a gardener who realizes that the weeds are growing faster than he can pull them. On the worlds of the fringe, the implementation of the Imperial tide had become a grim, mechanical process. The splendor of the early compliance ceremonies had been replaced by the arrival of the tax fleets. Entire generations of young men and women were drafted into the Imperial army, sent to die on worlds they had never heard of to protect a peace they would never enjoy. The industrialization of these planets was total. The forests were leveled to build factorums, and the oceans were drained to cool the massive heat sinks of the hive cities. The Emperor's vision of a unified humanity was being realized, but it was a unity of uniformity, a gray, sterile existence where the unique character of human cultures was ground down into a single, efficient pulp. This was the price of survival in a hostile universe, yet many on the ground began to wonder if the survival of the species was worth the death of the spirit. The Imperial truth, in its rejection of the supernatural, had left a void where wonder and awe used to reside, and into that void crept a chilling sense of purposelessness. The Emperor, meanwhile, remained entombed in his work beneath the palace. To him, the complaints of the Primarchs and the grumbling of the Tide Worlds were mere background noise compared to the existential threat he sought to neutralize. He was racing against a clock that only he could hear, building a future where humanity would be free from the predations of the warp. But in his focus on the destination, he had perhaps underestimated the toll the journey was taking on his followers. The Golden Throne was not just a seat of power. It was a symbol of the Emperor's increasing detachment from the physical reality of his empire. He was becoming a concept, a distant sun that provided light but no warmth. His sons, the Primarchs, were left to interpret his silence, and in that silence, each found the echoes of their own deepest insecurities. The unity of the Crusade, once a shimmering, unbreakable shield, was beginning to show the first microscopic fissures. They were not yet visible to the naked eye, covered by the gold leaf of propaganda and the thunderous reports of new victories. But the atmosphere had changed. The confidence of the early years had hardened into a brittle, defensive arrogance. The soldiers of the legions no longer looked at the stars with curiosity, but with a predatory gaze, searching for the next enemy to justify their existence. The Great Crusade was a machine that could only function while it was moving forward. The moment it stopped, the internal pressures of its own massive weight threatened to crush it from within. The silence of the void was no longer a peaceful one. It was the silence of a held breath, a moment of agonizing tension before the first crack of the thunder. As the sun dipped below the horizon of another conquered world, casting long, distorted shadows across the marble plazas, the air grew cold. The statues of the Emperor stood silent, their blind stone eyes staring out at an empire that was perfect in its design and tragic in its execution. The Great Crusade was reaching its zenith, a moment of absolute power that carried within it the seeds of its own exhaustion. The War Master turned away from the stars, the heavy plates of his armor clanking softly in the stillness of his chambers. The dream was still intact, the light was still bright, but the gravity of the throne was pulling harder than ever before, dragging the galaxy toward a fate that even the gods had not foreseen. The transition from a galaxy of conquest to a galaxy of governance brought with a suffocating stillness, a quietude that felt more predatory than the roar of 1,000 cannons. As the Great Crusade reached the apex of its expansion, the psychological landscape of the Imperium began to mirror the cold, sterile geometry of the hive cities rising across the Segmentum Majoris. On the world of terror, the Emperor remained secluded architect, his mind entwined with the psychic machinery of the Golden Throne, weaving a future that his son could neither see nor comprehend. This withdrawal was the first true catalyst for the erosion of the unified spirit. To the Primarchs, who had once stood as a literal extensions of their father's hand, the Emperor's physical absence was a wound that refused to close. They were the masters of the physical realm, the champions of a secular truth, yet they found themselves adrift in a sea of bureaucratic mandates and distant decrees that lacked the vital warmth of a parent's approval. The most hopeless battle had evolved into a conflict of purpose. In the barracks of the Legiones Astartes, the transhuman warriors began to look upon their own bolters with a strange, detached curiosity. They had been forged for the singular purpose of annihilation, yet the galaxy was rapidly running out of monsters to slay. The peace that the Imperial truth promised was a desert of administrative efficiency, where the warrior's soul was an obsolete relic. This realization did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow, corrosive realization that ate at the foundations of their loyalty. The Primarchs, sensitive to the morale of their sons, felt this existential drift most acutely. Lemon Rust took his space wolves into the most hostile fringes of the void, seeking a savagery that would remind them of their nature, while Conrad Kurz allowed the darkness of his own visions to turn his legion into a tool of pure terror, a desperate attempt to enforce an order that he no longer believed in. Horus Lupercal, as the War Master, was the only one who attempted to maintain the facade of a coherent vision. He moved between the expeditionary fleets like a ghost of the Great Crusade's early glory, his voice still carrying the resonance of a time when the path was clear and the enemy was external. But even Horus was changing. The weight of the Council of Terror's demands, the constant call for higher ties, more recruits, and more stringent compliance, began to grate against his martial sensibilities. He saw his brothers being treated as planetary governors rather than the demigods they were, and he felt the sting of their collective resentment. The atmosphere on the vengeful spirit was no longer one of triumphant anticipation. It was a heavy, stagnant air, filled with the unspoken grievances of 1,000 worlds that had been conquered but never truly understood. The unity of the Imperium was becoming a gilded cage, a structure of immense beauty and strength that offered no room for the very humans it was meant to protect. Beneath the surface of this ordered society, the imperial truth was beginning to fracture under its own weight. The Emperor had forbidden the worship of any deity, yet the sheer scale of his achievements and the terrifying majesty of his primarchs demanded a spiritual outlet that the secular creed could not provide. In the shadows of the forged worlds and the depths of the hive bottoms, the Lectitio Divinitatis began to circulate, a forbidden text that dared to name the Emperor as a god. This was the ultimate irony of the Crusade. The more the Emperor insisted on his humanity, the more his subjects were driven to deify him. The silence of the void was being filled by the whispered prayers of the desperate, a psychic resonance that the navigators felt as a low, disturbing thrum in the warp. This was not the work of the alien or the traitor, but the natural consequence of a species that had been stripped of its myths and left with only the cold, hard vacuum of reason. The logistics of the Imperium had become a labyrinth that even the most advanced cogitators struggled to map. The flow of resources from the periphery to the core was a constant, draining effort that left many newly compliant worlds on the brink of starvation. The tithe was not a gift. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid. The administrators of the Administratum, safe in their bunkers on Terra, viewed these planetary struggles as statistical anomalies to be corrected with a stroke of a quill. This disconnect between the reality of the front and the theory of the center created a dangerous volatility. The soldiers of the Imperial army, many of whom were now second or third generation Crusaders. By the midpoint of the 2nd century of the Great Crusade, the galaxy had been largely broken to the Emperor's bit. Yet the silence that followed the thundering hooves of the legions was not one of peace, but of profound, hollow exhaustion. On the command decks of the massive expeditionary fleets, the air was perpetually recycled, tasting of ozone, machine oil, and the dry, ancient scent of parchment. To the mortal officers of the Imperial army, the Crusade had become an inheritance of infinite logistics, a never-ending cycle of supply manifests, troop rotations, and the cold, mathematical calculation of compliance. The initial fire of liberation, that blinding spark that had ignited on Terra and scorched its way through the Segmentum Solar, had settled into a low, smoldering heat. The most hopeless battle was no longer being fought against the overt horrors of the xenos, but against the creeping realization that the galaxy was far larger and far colder than the imperial truth had ever dared to admit. Horus Lupercal, standing at the prow of the vengeful spirit, looked out at the swirling nebulae of the galactic core and felt the spiritual weight of his father's silence. The Emperor had retreated into the subterranean depths of the Imperial Palace, his mind turned toward the unseen architecture of the webway, leaving his sons to govern a domain that was becoming increasingly unmanageable. Horus was a war master, the proxy of a god who denied his own divinity, and the strain of that paradox was beginning to etch deep lines into his transhuman features. He was the glue holding together a brotherhood of demigods who were starting to look upon one another with a predatory suspicion. To the Primarchs, the Crusade was their mother and their father, the only life they had ever known. The prospect of a completion was not a victory, but a looming obsolescence. They were weapons of mass destruction being asked to transition into architect of a civil society, a task for which their gene-forged temperaments were fundamentally ill-suited. On the newly integrated world of Aurelius, the transition to imperial rule was marked by the systematic dismantling of the local identity. The Great Crusade did not just conquer, it overwrote. The ancient libraries were purged of superstition, replaced by the sterile, logical texts of the cult mechanicus and the secular philosophy of the iterators. The citizens moved through the streets of their new, prefabricated hive cities with a rhythmic, mechanical listlessness. They were safe from the predations of the dark, yes, but they were also stripped of the myths that had given their ancestors the strength to survive the long night. This was a hopeless battle of the common man, to find a reason to continue in a universe where the Emperor had declared that there was no higher purpose than the service of the state. The light of reason was supposed to be a beacon, but to many, It felt like the harsh, unflattering glare of an interrogator's lamp, revealing only the date and the despair of their own insignificance. The legions themselves were changing, their cultures diverging as they spent decades isolated from one another in the deep void. The Ultramarines were building a miniature empire of law and order, while the Night Lords were descending into a cycle of terror that even their brothers found distasteful. The Word-bearers, under the brooding gaze of Lorga, were searching for a faith that the Emperor had forbidden, their silence masking a hunger that would eventually consume the stars. This fragmentation was the inevitable result of a crusade that had outgrown its own center. The Emperor was a distant sun, providing enough light to see by, but no longer enough warmth to keep the blood of his sons from cooling. The unity of the early years was now a carefully maintained illusion, a mask of gold worn over a face of iron and glass. As the Great Crusade entered its final decades of uncontested expansion, the atmosphere within the Imperium attained a quality of brittle glass, shimmering, magnificent, but possessed of a hidden fragility that resonated with every beat of the war engine's heart. On the hive world of Proxima, and 1,000 spheres like it, the architecture of the Emperor's vision had reached its aesthetic and functional peak. The skylines were dominated by macrostatuary of the Primarchs, their stone eyes gazing out over seas of smog and industry with a paternal sternness that brooked no dissent. The most hopeless battle had transitioned from the kinetic violence of planetary invasion into a slow, atmospheric erosion of the old human spirit. To the billions living in the shadow of the Aquila, the imperial truth was no longer philosophy of liberation. It was the atmosphere itself, invisible, omnipresent, and utterly cold. The secular light that had promised to banish the terrors of the long night had succeeded so thoroughly that it had bleached the galaxy of its color, leaving behind a monochrome reality of duty, quota, and silence. In the high orbit of the Eleanor sector, the gathering of the fleets represented the greatest concentration of human military power ever assembled. It was to be the triumph of triumphs, a moment where the Emperor would finally acknowledge the completion of the Crusade's primary phase. Yet, beneath the gold leaf hulls and the celebratory Vox transmissions, the Primarchs moved through their flagships like restless predators confined to gilded cages. The Brotherhood, once forged in the fires of the early conquests, had become a complex web of silent rivalries and unspoken resentments. They looked at the maps of the galaxy and saw not a frontier, but a finished puzzle. For beings designed for the infinite scale of war, the prospect of a static, managed peace was a form of slow death. Horus Lupercal, the brightest among them, felt this existential dread more acutely than his brothers. He was a master of the crusade, yet he could sense the Emperor's mind drifting further toward the subterranean secrets of terror, leaving the War Master to oversee a machine that was starting to grind against its own gears. The logistics of maintaining this golden age had become a nightmare of bureaucratic inertia. The Council of Terror, emboldened by the Emperor's withdrawal, began to exert a fiscal and administrative pressure that felt like a secondary conquest of the worlds of the fringe. The tithe was no longer a contribution to a shared cause. It was an extraction of lifeblood. On worlds that had only recently been brought into compliance, the arrival of the administratum's black-clad scribes was feared as much as the arrival of the Astartes had been. They did not come with bolters, but with ledgers that demanded the output of entire generations. This was a hopeless battle of the provincial governor to satisfy the insatiable hunger of a throne world that viewed the galaxy as a series of spreadsheets. The resentment this fostered was quiet, buried deep beneath the surface of official loyalty, but it created a low-frequency hum of instability that vibrated through the warp, a psychic resonance that the navigators found increasingly difficult to filter out. The Emperor, meanwhile, remained the silent center of this storm. His focus on the human webway was a project of such staggering importance that the daily grievances of his empire seemed like the buzzing of insects. He was building a bypass for the soul, a way for humanity to step out of the predatory shadow of the warp forever. But in doing so, he had become the ultimate absentee landlord. His silence was interpreted by some as wisdom, by others as indifference, and by a few as a betrayal. The Primarchs, who required a validation of their father to sustain their own sense of purpose, were left to fill the silence with their own interpretations of his will. This was the era where the seeds of the coming cataclysm were sown in the fertile soil of neglected pride. The light of the Astronomicon was as steady as ever, but it was a light that no longer promised a new day. It merely illuminated the magnitude of the work that remained, and the loneliness of those tasked with performing it. In the lower hive levels of the core worlds, far beneath the gaze of the statues and the censors, the human element of the Imperium was beginning to warp. The absence of the supernatural had not ended the human need for the divine, it had merely driven it underground. Forbidden cults, dedicated to the God Emperor, flourished in the damp, dark places where the imperial truth could not reach. These were not the chaotic worshippers of the later ages, but desperate souls looking for a father figure in a universe that had become a cold, clockwork machine. They prayed to the Emperor to save them from the very system he had created, a paradox that highlighted the fundamental tension at the heart of the Great Crusade. The most hopeless battle was the attempt to legislate away the irrationality of the human heart, a struggle that the Emperor was winning on the surface, but losing in the depths. As the sun set over the parade grounds of Ullanor, the long shadows of the Titans stretched across the earth like the fingers of a giant. The air was still, the engines of 1,000 ships idling in a low, expectant thrum. The Great Crusade was at its absolute zenith, a moment of such blinding perfection that it seemed as though time itself might stop. But the atmosphere was charged with a heavy, atmospheric pressure, the feeling of a tide that has reached its highest point and is about to turn. The War Master stood on the balcony of his command spire, looking out at the endless ranks of his warriors. He felt the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders, and for the first time, he felt the cold touch of the void not as a challenge, but as an ending. The dream of the Imperium was a magnificent architecture of iron and gold, a testament to what humanity could achieve when guided by a single, unyielding will. But as the silence of the night settled over the triumph, it was a silence filled with the echoes of everything that had been sacrificed to reach this peak. The galaxy was won, the enemy was broken, and the Emperor's light was total. Yet, in the quiet, the atmosphere felt thin, and the stars seemed to pull further away, leaving the masters of the galaxy alone in their victory. The atmospheric pressure of the Ullanor sector had reached a point of physical density, a weight of expectation that seemed to press against the very hulls of the thousands of warships gathered in the void. This was a moment the Great Crusade had been marching toward for 2 centuries, the ultimate confirmation of man's dominion over the stars. Yet, as the gold-clad custodes stood like statues of living fire upon the battle observation platforms, the air was not filled with the simple joy of victory. Instead, it was thick with the scent of ozone, the heavy thrum of idle warp drives, and a profound, underlying sense of finality. The most hopeless battle was no longer a matter of breaking the back of the Orc empires. It had become the struggle to define what came after the war. For the Primarchs, who had known only the clarity of the front lines, the stillness of Ullanor felt less like a triumph and more like a funeral for the life they understood. The Emperor's presence during these final stages was a dual phenomenon. He was physically present, a blinding sun of psychic and martial power, yet he remained spiritually distant, his eyes fixed on a horizon that none of his sons could perceive. He moved through the ranks of the legions with a grace that transcended the material realm, his silence a profound statement on the transition of the Imperium from a military endeavor to a civil one. This was the era of the Great Resignation, where the warriors were being told that their primary work was done. The Council of Terror, led by Malcador the Sigillite, was preparing to take the reins of the galaxy, moving the seat of power from the war room to the administrative chamber. To the Primarchs, this shift felt like a betrayal of the blood oaths they had sworn. They were being asked to step aside from men who had never seen the horror of a xenos incursion, to surrender the worlds they had bled for to the cold scrutiny of the tax collector and the clerk. Horus Lupercal, standing at the right hand of his father, felt the shifting of the tectonic plates of the Imperium most keenly. He was to be named War Master, the supreme commander of all the Emperor's forces, a title that carried as much burden as it did glory. While his brothers looked upon the title with varying degrees of jealousy or relief, Horus saw it for what it truly was, a buffer between the Emperor's secret designs and the growing resentment of the legions. He was being made the face of a father who was withdrawing into the shadows of the Imperial palace. The atmosphere between the father and the son was one of profound, unspoken complexity. Horus wanted to ask the questions that were burning in his mind. Why the secrecy? Why the sudden departure? Why the reliance on mortal bureaucrats? But the Emperor's gaze was a barrier that even the War Master could not breach. The light of the Imperial truth was at its most intense, yet it felt as though it were being directed inward, leaving the rest of the galaxy in a long, lengthening shadow. On the surface of Ullanor, the parade was a masterpiece of mechanical and genetic perfection. Thousands of Titans walked the plains, their foghorns sounding like the lowing of ancient, metallic beasts. The legions marched in blocks of color that stretched to the horizon, a sea of ceramites and bolters that represented the absolute peak of human achievement. But to the soldiers in the ranks, there was a feeling of being part of a magnificent, fading dream. They were the masters of the galaxy, yet they felt like transients, ghosts haunting a victory that belonged to a future they would never see. The hopeless battle was a realization that they were the tools of a transition, not the residents of the peace they had created. The discipline was perfect. The banners were pristine, but the hearts of the men were heavy with the weight of an era that was ending before their very eyes. The Emperor's final decree at Ullanor was not one of continued conquest, but of consolidation. He spoke of the need for humanity to govern itself, to move beyond the reliance on the transhuman and the divine. This was the ultimate expression of the imperial truth. Yet to those who had sacrificed everything for his name, it sounded like a dismissal. The withdrawal of the Emperor to Terra to work on his secret project was the final act of a father who had finished with his children. The atmosphere in the aftermath of the triumph was one of hollow splendor. The feasts were grand, the speeches were eloquent, but the silence that followed was filled with the first, faint whispers of the coming storm. The unity of the crusade was a beautiful, fragile shell, and the vacuum left by the Emperor's departure was already being filled by the unspoken anxieties and ambitions of 20 demigods who no longer had a shared destination. As the fleets began to disperse from the Ullanor sector, heading back into the dark reaches of the galaxy, the stars seemed to pull further away. The Great Crusade was officially continuing, but the spirit of the endeavor had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a unified movement toward a golden future. It was a series of disconnected campaigns, led by commanders who felt the cold touch of an empire that was becoming a stranger to them. The most hopeless battle was now a war against the silence of terror, a struggle to maintain a sense of purpose in a galaxy that had been declared one while the darkness still lingered in the warp. The machines continued to hum, the tides continued to flow, and the law of the Emperor remained absolute, but the warmth was gone. The War Master stood on the observation deck of the Vengeful Spirit, watching the light of Ullanor fade into the distance. He felt the weight of his new title like a collar of iron. The galaxy was his command, yet he felt more like a prisoner than a king. The Emperor's light was a beacon on the horizon, but it was a distant one, illuminating a path that led away. The departure from Ullanor was not the thunderous charge of a new era, but a slow, tectonic drifting of purpose that left the galaxy feeling colder than it had in 2 centuries. As the Emperor's golden barge, the Bucephalus, accelerated toward the Sol system, it left behind a vacuum that no title, however grand, could truly occupy. Horus Lupercal now wore the mantle of War Master, a rank that made him the ultimate arbiter of human military might, yet the velvet weight of the cloak felt more like a burial shroud than a garment of state. On the strategic decks of the Vengeful Spirit, the holographic star charts pulsed with the light of 1,000,000 compliant worlds, but the data streams were now tainted by the dry, restrictive language of the Council of Terror. The most hopeless battle had entered its most insidious phase, the struggle to maintain a warrior's honor within a sprawling, civilian-led bureaucracy. The atmospheric tension on the flagship was palpable, a thick, cloying sense of being watched by the very empire the Legion had bled to create. The Council of Terror, emboldened by the Emperor's physical absence, began to tighten, the logistical noose around the neck of the Crusade. New edicts arrived daily, demanding that the Primax justify their expenditures of ammunition, fuel, and human lives. To the demigods of the Astartes, this was an ontological insult. They were the architects of the age, the sons of the master of mankind, yet they were being treated as unruly vassals by mortal men who had never felt the heat of a plasma burn or the psychic pressure of a xenos mind. This shift in authority created a profound atmospheric dissonance. On worlds like 6319, the Imperial army garrisons were no longer seen as liberators, but as the enforcers of an increasingly distant and demanding throne world. The Imperial truth, once a soaring anthem of reason, was being used as a blunt instrument to hammer the diversity of human culture into a single, compliant shape. This was the era of the Great Disconnect, where the sword of the Emperor was being blunted by the pens of his scribes. Horus moved through this new reality with a diplomat's grace, but beneath the surface, the cracks were deepening. He spent his hours in the strategium, not planning grand campaigns of liberation, but mediating the petty squabbles between his brothers and the Terran tax collectors. He saw the brooding silence of Perturbo, who felt his siege masters were being wasted on garrison duty. He watched the darkening moods of Angron and Chaos, whose legions were being censured for the very brutality that had won the Emperor his throne. Horus was the knot that held the fraying threads of the Imperium together, but even a Primacer's patience has limits. The Emperor's silence from the depths of the palace was a psychic wound that resonated through the warp, a sense of abandonment that the War Master felt as a physical ache. The light of the Astronomicon was still bright, but it was a cold, indifferent light that illuminated the distance between the father and the son. In the lower levels of the expeditionary fleets, the mood was one of weary, cynical endurance. The soldiers of the Imperial army, the billions of men and women who formed the backbone of the Crusade, were beginning to feel like transients in their own lives. They moved from one war zone to the next, their victories celebrated by distant crowds they would never meet, while their own homeworlds were being transformed into industrial hellscapes to feed the war machine. This was a hopeless battle of the common soldier, to find meaning in a sacrifice that seemed increasingly abstract. The secular creed of the Imperium offered no comfort for the soul, and in the absence of faith, a bitter pragmatism took root. The camaraderie of the foxhole became the only true religion, a loyalty to the man beside them rather than the distant figure on the throne. This shift in allegiance was subtle, but it was a foundation upon which the future tragedies of the galaxy would be built. The Mechanicum, too, was retreating into its own private obsessions. The tech priests of Mars viewed the transition of power with a mixture of calculation and disdain. They saw the mortal bureaucracy of Terra as a threat to their autonomy and their sacred search for knowledge. They began to hoard their technological secrets, fortifying their forge worlds and treating the Crusade's demands for hardware with begrudging, transactional air. The alliance that had built the Imperium was becoming a marriage of convenience, held together by the gravity of the emperors, were but lacking the shared vision of the early years. The atmosphere in the forges was one of cold, binary logic, where the human cost of production was irrelevant compared to the purity of the machine. The machines were humming, the engines were turning, but the spirit of the Crusade was being hollowed out, replaced by mechanical, joyless efficiency. The atmosphere across the Segmentum Pacificus had begun to thicken with a peculiar, heavy stillness, a quality of air that felt less like the calm of peace and more like the bated breath of a galaxy awaiting an inevitable sentence. As the Great Crusade pushed its final, jagged frontos into the halo stars, the psychological weight of 2 centuries of total war began to manifest as a visible exhaustion in the eyes of the mortal crews and the stone-faced Astartes. On the command decks of the expeditionary fleets, the rhythmic pulse of the warp drive served as a constant reminder of the Imperium's intrusive presence in the celestial void. The most hopeless battle was no longer a conflict of ballistics orbital bombardments. It had evolved into a struggle against the entropy of the Imperial vision itself. The Emperor's light, though channeled through the tireless psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, felt increasingly like a clinical, distant star, illuminating the path of the ships but offering no warmth to the souls of the men who inhabited them. In the wake of the Eleanor triumph, the newly appointed War Master, Horus Lupercal, moved through the halls of the vengeful spirit with a grace that was increasingly shadowed by the burden of his singular authority. He was a proxy for a father who had retreated into the subterranean silences of terror, leaving the management of 1,000,000 worlds to a son who craved a different kind of validation. The diplomacy required to maintain the cohesion of his brother Primarchs was becoming a labyrinthine task of managing egos and historical grievances. Each legion was beginning to reflect the specific, often isolated, character of its master. The Ultramarines refined their codes of law in the sanctuary of Macragge, while the World Eaters descended into a rhythmic, bloody madness that the official reports of the iterators struggled to sanitize. This divergence was the first true indicator that the monolithic unity of the early Crusade was a facade, a golden veil draped over a collection of increasingly disparate and volatile entities. On the world of Davin, a moon that would later become a name of infamy, the atmospheric conditions were a testament to the strange, lingering resilience of the old ways. The local cultures had been brought into compliance, their warrior lodges officially dismantled, and their traditional rites replaced by the secular mandates of the imperial truth. However, beneath the surface of this enforced reason, the old myths remained, hibernating in the damp, dark places of the soul. The imperial administrators viewed these remnants as harmless curiosities, a primitive stage of development that would eventually be ironed out by the progress of the machine. They failed to realize that the vacuum created by the removal of the divine was an invitation for something far more predatory. The most hopeless battle was the attempt to govern a species that still dreamed of gods in a universe where the Emperor had declared such things to be mere shadows of the mind. The logistics of the Imperium had reached a scale that defied human comprehension, becoming a self-sustaining machine that required a constant intake of lives and resources to prevent its own collapse. The tide shifts were no longer symbols of protection but omens of scarcity. On worlds that had only known the Imperium for a generation, the memory of independence was being replaced by the grinding reality of industrial servitude. The Emperor's dream of a unified humanity was being realized through the cold application of force and the systematic erasure of local history. It was a masterpiece of order, but it was an order that lacked a heartbeat. The silence of the void was being filled by the hum of factorums and the scratching of a billion quills, a mechanical symphony that celebrated the triumph of the state over the individual. To the common laborer in the deep hives, the Emperor was a distant, theoretical concept, while the tax collector was a very real and present terror. Within the legions, the first flickers of a new kind of loyalty were being forged, loyalty not to the distant throne world, but to the primarchs who walked beside them in the mud and the blood. The warrior lodges, once secret and informal, were becoming the primary social structures of the Astartes, providing a sense of brotherhood that the cold edicts of the Council of Terror could not offer. These lodges were the fertile ground where the first seeds of the coming tragedy were planted, nurtured by a sense of being misunderstood by the mortal bureaucracy they served. The Astartes felt like the forgotten children of a father who had moved on to more important works, and in their isolation, they turned to one another. The atmosphere of the crusade was shifting from one of shared purpose to one of tribal survival, a fragmentation that the War Master saw but felt powerless to stop without appearing to challenge his father's wisdom today. As the sun set over the jagged peaks of the Davin moon, the light took on a sickly, bruised quality, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains where the legion stood in silent vigil. The air was still, filled with the scent of swamp water and ancient, rotting things. The Great Crusade was a magnificent architecture of iron and gold, but it was built upon a foundation of secrets and unacknowledged phase. The Emperor's light was at its most blinding, yet it was precisely this intensity that made the shadows so deep. The galaxy was a silent cathedral of industry, waiting for the first crack in the glass to let the cold wind of the warp back in. The War Master stood on his balcony, looking out at the stars, and for the first time he felt the weight of the silence from terror not as a trust, but as a void. The dream was still intact, the banners still flew, and the machines continued to turn the gears of an empire that spanned the stars. But the atmosphere was one of a held breath, a moment of profound atmospheric tension before the first movement of catastrophe that would redefine the meaning of hopeless. The galaxy was won, yet the victory felt like a shroud, a golden veil cast over a universe that had forgotten how to hope for anything more than the absence of pain. The transition of the Great Crusade from a movement of liberation into a static monument of administration had, by its 3rd century, created a specific kind of atmospheric pressure, a density of spirit that felt like the air before a tectonic shift. In the Segmentum Solar, the heart of the Imperium beat with a mechanical, relentless precision, but at the fringes, the pulse was becoming erratic. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, the War Master Horus Lupercal stood amidst a forest of flickering hololiths, each representing a compliance, a tide report, or a petition for military intervention. The most hopeless battle was no longer being waged against the Greenskin or the Eldar. It was a war of attrition against the sheer, crushing boredom of a galaxy that had been categorized, taxed, and silenced. The charisma that had once unified the Primarchs was now being stretched thin across a million light-years, acting as a structural dampener for the growing resentments of brothers who felt the Emperor's shadow growing colder and more distant with every passing sidereal year. The Council of Terror had become a secondary sun in the Imperial firmament, one that emitted not light, but the gray, suffocating dust of bureaucracy. To the Legiones Astartes, these mortal masters were an anatomical impossibility, men of parchment and ink who presumed to dictate the movements of the gene-forged titans who had conquered the stars. This friction was the primary source of the atmospheric rut that was beginning to settle over the expeditionary fleets. The warriors of the 16th Legion, once the joyous vanguard of the Emperor's will, now moved with somber, industrial efficiency. They looked at the worlds they had saved, and saw only the rising skeletons of hive cities and the black smoke of factorums. The Imperial truth had successfully banished the old gods, but it had neglected to provide anything to fill the void except for the cold, hard logic of the state. This was a hopeless battle of the philosopher, to maintain a belief in a rational universe when the human heart still craved the irrationality of awe. In the secret chambers of the warrior lodges, the atmosphere was markedly different. Hey! Away from the prying eyes of the iterators and the official censors, the Astartes allowed themselves to feel the weight of their abandonment. They spoke of the Emperor not as a living god, but as a distant father who had moved on to a more important family, leaving his firstborn to act as the janitors of his new empire. The rituals of these lodges were becoming increasingly elaborate, a mimicry of the very superstitions the Crusade was designed to eradicate. They sought a connection that was no longer provided by the throne world, a sense of belonging that was rooted in the brotherhood of the blade rather than the decree of the law. This subtle shift in loyalty was a silent poison in the veins of the Imperium, a resonance that the War Master recognized but found himself unable to excise, for he too felt the same cold wind blowing from the direction of terror. The Emperor's secret work had become the ultimate ghost in the machine. To the Primax, it was a wall of silence that stood between them and the architect of their existence. While Magnus the Red attempted to peer through that wall with his psychic sight, and Lorca sought to bypass it through forbidden devotions, Horus attempted to ignore it through the sheer force of his duties. But the silence was a physical thing, a psychic pressure that made the warp tide churn with a new, aggressive energy. The navigators reported sightings of ancient, malevolent geometries shifting in the tides of the immaterium, shapes that seemed to mock the secular. The atmospheric density of the late Great Crusade had reached a point of psychic saturation, a heavy, velvet stillness that seemed to muffle the once triumphant heraldry of the expeditionary fleets. As the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet moved through the shifting tides of the southern galactic rim, the internal environment of the vengeful spirit reflected the broader, cooling temperament of the Imperium. The air in the grand corridors was a pressurized blend of machine spirit incense and the metallic tang of polished ceramite, yet it carried a new, subterranean scent, the dry, bitter aroma of old parchment and administrative stagnation. To the warriors of the 16th Legion, the most hopeless battle was no longer found in the breach of a xenos fortress, but in the sterile silence of the diplomatic chambers where the highborn iterators and the grey-clad clerks of the Council of Terra now dictated the terms of existence. The Crusade was maturing into an empire, and in that maturation, the raw, solar fire of the Emperor's early vision was being eclipsed by the lengthening shadows of 1,000 bureaucratic mandates. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, stood within the strategium of his flagship, his massive form illuminated by the ghostly blue radiance of a tactical hololith. He was the apex of human achievement, a being of such profound charisma and tactical genius that his very presence could turn the tide of a solar war, yet he looked upon the glowing nodes of 100 newly compliant worlds with a sense of mounting isolation. The Emperor's withdrawal to the throne world had left a void that was being filled not by paternal guidance, but by the cold, transactional demands of the tithe. Horus felt the friction of this transition in every vox transmission from his brothers. He heard the simmering resentment in the voice of Perturbo, who saw his legion's genius reduced to the construction of endless garrison fortresses. He felt the distracted, haunted fervor of Lorga, who sought a spiritual anchor that the secular imperial truth explicitly forbade. Horus was a linchpin of a galaxy-spanning machine that was starting to vibrate with the frequency of its own internal contradictions, a master of war being asked to oversee a peace that felt increasingly like a slow, structural decay on the worlds of the fringe. The implementation of the imperial truth had become a clinical, almost surgical process. The arrival of a fleet was no longer a moment of mythic awakening, but the initiation of logistical audit. The ancient cultures of humanity, preserved through the long, dark millennia of the Age of Strife, were being systematically disassembled. Their local histories were archived and then deleted. Their traditional leadership was replaced by governors whose primary qualification was their ability to meet the production quotas of the administratum. This was a hopeless battle of the provincial soul, to remain human in a system that viewed humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be celebrated. The peace that the Emperor had promised was absolute, but it was a piece of the ledger and the forge, a silence that followed the crushing of any identity that did not align with a singular, monochromatic vision of the throne world. The light of reason was supposed to be a guide, but to those living in the shadow of the hive spires, it felt like the cold, unblinking eye of a jailer. Within the legions, the psychological distance from terror was manifesting as a return to tribalism. The warrior lodges, once informal gatherings for the exchange of martial philosophies, were becoming the true centers of gravity for the Astartes. In these smoke-filled chambers, away from the prying eyes of the iterators and the council's observers, the soldiers spoke of their grievances. They spoke of a father who had abandoned them to work on secrets he would not share. They spoke of a galaxy won by their blood being handed over to men who had never felt the kick of a bolter. This was the era of the Great Disconnect, where the primary loyalty of the transhuman warrior was shifting from the abstract concept of the Imperium to the tangible presence of their primarch. The atmosphere was one of a family dinner where the head of the house has left the table, leaving the children to argue over the remains of the meal while the candles flicker and the shadows outside the windows grow long and predatory. The Mechanicum of Mars, meanwhile, was retreating further into its own binary fortresses. The tech priests viewed the rising civilian authority of Terra with a calculation that bordered on hostility. They saw the Crusade not as a humanitarian mission, but as a grand technological reclamation. Their loyalty was to the knowledge they recovered, not the people they liberated. This divergence created a silent, structural tension that hummed through the infrastructure of every expeditionary fleet. The machines were becoming more sophisticated, the ships more lethal, and the production lines more efficient. But the spirit of the Alliance was becoming transactional. The Imperium was a body of immense strength, but its organs were starting to function independently of the brain, driven by their own specific agendas and their own private fears of what the future peace would demand of them. As a vengeful spirit prepared for its next jump into the unknown, Horus Lupercal walked the observation deck alone. The stars were brilliant, but they were also indifferent, a cold tapestry of light that had seen empires rise and fall long before the first human looked up from the soil of Terra. He thought of his father, sitting on the golden throne, his mind reaching into the sub-dimensions of the webway, and he wondered if the Emperor could still hear the heartbeat of the Crusade. The silence of the void was no longer a peaceful one. It was the silence of a held breath, the agonizing tension of a galaxy that had reached its zenith and was now staring into the abyss of its own success. The dream was still there, written in the banners and the statues, but it was a dream that felt increasingly like a memory, a golden morning that had passed into a heavy, stagnant afternoon. The War Master looked toward the distant spark of Sol, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the gravity of the future pulling at him, a future where the most hopeless battle will be fought not for compliance, but for survival. Then, with a practiced master command, he turned away from the stars and returned to the cold, blue light of the strategium, while the galaxy continued its slow, indifferent rotation toward the dark.